Dr. Ethan Cole had always believed in science, not miracles. As a microbiologist, he dedicated his life to unraveling the mysteries of bacteria, viruses, and the fundamental processes of life. His work was grounded in logic, evidence, and the scientific method. If something couldn't be explained through research, then it was merely an anomaly waiting to be understood. But on that fateful day, when the sky turned black over the Amazon rainforest, science became the last thing on his mind. The plane he was on, a small chartered aircraft, was supposed to be a straightforward flight from Manaus to a remote research station deep in the jungle. He and 3 other researchers were heading to study a newly discovered bacterial strain that could potentially revolutionize medicine. Ethan had been eager, excited even. This could be the breakthrough of a lifetime. Then the storm came. It wasn't a gradual descent into bad weather. One moment the sky was clear, the next they were engulfed in darkness. The turbulence hit like a sledgehammer, throwing the aircraft into chaos. The radio crackled, the pilot swore, and within minutes they lost all communication. Lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating a sky that looked as though it had been torn apart by some unseen force. The plane dropped suddenly, as if the air beneath it had vanished. Ethan's stomach lurched as alarms blared and the pilot screamed over the noise, "Brace for impact." Then, everything went white. When Ethan awoke, he was lying on his back, staring up at a sky that was far too bright. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine. His body felt like it had been beaten with steel pipes, and every breath sent a sharp pain through his ribs. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then reality came rushing back. The crash. He turned his head slowly, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through his skull. Blood trickled down his forehead, warm and sticky. His right leg throbbed in agony, bent at an unnatural angle. The jungle around him was eerily quiet. No sounds of people, no voices calling out for help. Just the distant hum of insects and the rustling of leaves in the wind. He tried to push himself up, but the pain in his leg flared like fire. He gritted his teeth and looked around. The wreckage of the plane was scattered in pieces, torn apart by the crash. A trail of twisted metal and burning debris stretched behind him, the fuselage broken in half. Where were the others? Hello? His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. Anyone there? Can you hear me? No response. Only the endless jungle. He dragged himself forward, biting down against the pain. His hands trembled as he searched through the wreckage. A mangled seatbelt, a torn backpack, a shattered tablet screen. Then he saw it. A body. Ethan swallowed hard and crawled toward it, dread pooling in his stomach. It was one of the researchers, Dr. Patel. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. A deep gash ran across her temple, and her chest didn't rise or fall. Dead. His breathing grew shallow as he looked around. There was no sign of the other 2 researchers. No sign of the pilot. Were they thrown from the wreckage? Had they wandered off in search of help? Ethan's head swam. He needed to focus. Needed to survive. First, he had to stop the bleeding. His medical training wasn't extensive, but he knew enough. He tore a strip from his ruined shirt and pressed it against the wound on his forehead. Next, his leg. The angle was bad, either broken or severely dislocated. Moving too much could make it worse. Then water, food, shelter. His survival instincts kicked in. He scanned the wreckage, looking for supplies. There, a partially crushed first aid kit. He dragged himself toward it, fingers fumbling as he pried it open. Painkillers, antiseptic, bandages. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He leaned against a fallen piece of the fuselage and forced himself to breathe. His body was weak, shaking from the shock and blood loss. He wouldn't last long like this. He needed help. But who would find him out here? The rainforest was vast, uncharted in places. The chances of a rescue team pinpointing his location were slim, and the storm had likely thrown them miles off course. He had to hold on. Hours passed. The sun shifted, casting long shadows through the dense canopy. The painkillers dulled his agony, but exhaustion weighed heavily on him. His eyelids drooped, his body growing colder. Then he heard it. A rustling in the trees. Ethan's breath caught. His mind raced. Could it be the others? A rescue team? Or something else? He tried to sit up, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. The rustling grew closer, deliberate. Something, or someone, was moving toward him. Then a shadow fell over him. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as he looked up. At first, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It was a figure, tall and slender, standing just at the edge of the wreckage. It had the vague shape of a human, but it wasn't human. Its skin shimmered, an iridescent shade of pale blue, as if light itself bent around it. Its arms were elongated, its fingers too thin, too delicate. But it was the eyes that unsettled him the most. Large, black, and impossibly deep, filled with something that wasn't just intelligence but an understanding far beyond human comprehension. A strange, glowing apparatus rested on its chest, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Ethan's breath hitched. His body screamed at him to move, to run, to do something, but he was frozen in place. The figure tilted its head slightly, observing him. Then a voice. No, not a voice. A thought. A presence in his mind. "You are hurt." Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The being took a step closer, moving with an unnatural grace. "You need healing." Ethan's vision blurred. His body was too weak, his mind too exhausted to fight it. As darkness crept at the edges of his vision, the last thing he saw was the alien kneeling beside him, placing a cool hand on his forehead. Then, the world faded to black. Ethan awoke to warmth. Not the stifling heat of the jungle, but something else. Something comforting, like being wrapped in a blanket on a cold night. He could hear a low hum, rhythmic and steady, as if the air itself was vibrating with life. Slowly his eyes fluttered open. The world around him was not the jungle. Gone were the twisted vines, the broken wreckage, and the damp, earthy scent of decay. Instead, he lay inside a chamber unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were smooth and curved, pulsating with a soft bioluminescent glow, shifting between blues, greens, and faint traces of violet. It was as if the walls were alive, breathing, in harmony with some unseen force. The air was thick but not oppressive, carrying a scent that was both sterile and sweet, like a mix of fresh rain and blooming flowers. Ethan's body felt different, lighter. The throbbing pain in his leg was gone. His head no longer ached. The gash on his forehead, which had bled profusely after the crash, now felt like nothing more than a faint memory. He tried to sit up, but a soft pressure pushed him back down. "Rest," a voice echoed, not in the air but inside his mind. Ethan's breath hitched as he turned his head. The being from before was standing beside him, watching him with those large obsidian eyes. In the dim glow of the chamber, Ethan could see it more clearly now. Its body was sleek and elongated, its skin shimmering in waves of iridescence. The light from the walls reflected off it in ways that made it seem almost translucent. Ethan's throat was dry, but he forced himself to speak. "Where am I?" The being tilted its head slightly as if considering his question. Then in that same telepathic voice it answered, "You are safe." Ethan swallowed. The others, the pilot, the researchers, did they survive? A pause. Then a quiet but firm response. "You were the only one found." Ethan's chest tightened. The only one? He had feared as much when he saw Patel's lifeless body, but he had still held onto a sliver of hope. The realization settled over him like a weight. He was alone. He squeezed his eyes shut, taking slow breaths. Grief could come later. Survival was still the priority. When he opened his eyes again, the being was holding something in its elongated fingers, a bowl filled with a thick, luminescent liquid. It pulsed faintly, shifting between a pale blue and silver hue. "Drink," the being said. "It will heal you." Ethan's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. He was a scientist. He didn't consume unknown substances, especially not ones given to him by an extraterrestrial being inside an organic-looking chamber that defied logic. But then again, nothing about this situation was logical. His body had already healed at an impossible rate. He should have been in excruciating pain, possibly even near death from his injuries. And yet, he felt stronger than he had in years. Something had already been done to him. His fingers trembled as he reached for the bowl. "What is it?" The being's dark eyes blinked slowly. "Milk." Ethan gave a weak, incredulous laugh. "Milk? From what?" There was no immediate answer. Instead, the being simply repeated, "Drink." Ethan hesitated only a moment longer before lifting the bowl to his lips. The liquid was warm, thicker than water but lighter than cream. As it touched his tongue, his senses exploded. It didn't taste like anything he could describe. Not sweet, not bitter, not salty or sour. It was everything at once, a sensation that defied his brain's ability to categorize it. The moment it slid down his throat, he felt it. A rush of energy coursed through him, spreading outward from his stomach to the tips of his fingers, the soles of his feet, the very ends of his hair. It was like fire and ice at the same time, a soothing yet invigorating force that pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. He gasped, his eyes widening. The being observed him with quiet patience. "The process has begun." Ethan's fingers tingled. He flexed his hands, watching as the skin on his palms seemed smoother. The bruises that had mottled his arms were vanishing before his eyes. His vision became sharper, clearer. Every detail in the chamber stood out in vivid clarity. "What is this?" Ethan whispered. The being finally spoke again. "It is regeneration." Ethan's mind reeled. Regeneration? Was that how his wounds had healed so quickly? Was this liquid altering him on a cellular level? This shouldn't be possible, he said half to himself. Human cells don't work this way, they don't. "You are human," the being interrupted, "but you are also adaptable." Ethan set the bowl down, breathing heavily. He could feel something happening inside him, something beyond just healing. His body was stronger. His thoughts were clearer. The exhaustion from the crash was gone, replaced by an almost unnatural vitality. He looked up at the being, suddenly aware of how small and fragile he must have seemed in comparison. "What are you?" Ethan finally asked. A pause. Then, the being said, "I am Saren." A name. That was something. A starting point. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind still struggling to process everything. "Are you a doctor?" "In your terms, yes." "Why help me?" Saren tilted its head again, a gesture that seemed almost contemplative. "You are not meant to die yet." Ethan shivered. The way Saren spoke, it was as if it knew something he didn't, as if it understood the very threads of fate itself. He exhaled sharply. "And this milk, what exactly is it? Where does it come from?" Saren was silent for a long moment before finally answering. "It comes from the source." Ethan frowned. "What's the source?" Saren didn't answer. Instead, it simply turned and walked toward a curved doorway that seemed to open seamlessly. As it approached, "You should rest now." Ethan watched as the alien disappeared into the next chamber, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He glanced down at the now empty bowl in his hands. This wasn't just healing. This wasn't just medicine. Something far more profound had just happened to him. And for the first time in his life, Dr. Ethan Cole, a man who had dedicated his entire career to understanding the mysteries of biology, realized that there were some things in the universe that science alone could not explain. Ethan lay on the soft, gel-like surface of what he assumed was a bed, staring up at the gently glowing ceiling of the chamber. His mind raced, trying to grasp the impossibility of what had happened. His body, once broken, bleeding, and weak, was now something else. Stronger, sharper. He flexed his fingers, watching the way his skin reacted. It looked normal, but it felt different, almost as if it were new. The sensation of the milk still lingered inside him, pulsing like an unseen current beneath his skin. The question swirled in his head. What had he ingested? What was happening to his body? And most importantly, who or what was Saren? He had never believed in the supernatural. To him, even the concept of extraterrestrial life had always been hypothetical, something for astronomers and conspiracy theorists to debate. And yet, here he was. Not only had he encountered an alien being, but he was inside what he could only assume was a structure created by an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. His thoughts were interrupted as the entrance to the chamber slid open seamlessly, revealing Saren. The being moved with effortless grace, its luminous eyes locking onto him. "You are awake," Saren stated. Ethan sat up. "Yeah, and I have a lot of questions." Saren regarded him for a moment before nodding. "Ask." Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "What exactly did that milk do to me?" "It has begun the process of cellular enhancement," Saren replied. "Your body is adapting, becoming more resilient." "Resilient how?" Ethan asked. Saren stepped closer, and before Ethan could react, the alien extended a long, delicate finger and sliced a small cut across Ethan's forearm. Ethan flinched. "What the hell?" He stopped mid-sentence, eyes widening as the wound on his arm healed before his eyes. Within seconds, the skin closed seamlessly, leaving not even a scar. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "That's impossible." Saren tilted its head. "It is the nature of the source." There it was again. The source. Ethan clenched his jaw. "You keep mentioning this source. What is it?" Saren studied him for a long moment before answering. "It is life in its purest form. It nourishes, heals, and strengthens. It is what allows us to exist beyond limitations." Ethan frowned. "So it's some kind of biological substance?" "In part," Saren said. "But it is more than that. It is the foundation of existence itself." Ethan let out a shaky breath. "And now it's inside me?" Saren nodded. "Yes, you are changing." Ethan's mind reeled. He glanced at his arm again, then at his hands, as if expecting to see some obvious mutation, but he still looked human. "For now." "What's the end result?" he asked, voice quieter this time. Saren stepped back, its eyes glowing faintly. "You will soon understand." Ethan swallowed hard. That wasn't exactly comforting. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to stay calm. He needed to think. If his body had been altered, if he was becoming something else, what did that mean for him in the long run? Would he still be human? He took a deep breath, focusing on what he did know. His body was healing at an accelerated rate. He felt stronger, more aware. There was no denying that whatever had been in that milk was changing him on a fundamental level. The scientist in him was both terrified and fascinated. Finally, he looked back at Saren. "Why me?" Saren's expression remained unreadable. "Because you were the one who survived." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "That's not an answer." Saren studied him before responding. "You were at the edge of death. The source does not choose at random. It seeks those who are on the verge of crossing into the void, those who can be restored." Ethan exhaled sharply. "So, I was just lucky?" Saren didn't respond, but something in its gaze suggested that luck had little to do with it. Before Ethan could press further, Saren gestured toward the entrance. "You must come with me." Ethan hesitated but eventually stood. The chamber's floor was soft beneath his feet, and he felt an odd sense of balance. Lighter, yet more grounded. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't just healing. His very being was adapting. He followed Saren through the organic-looking corridor, the walls shifting in color as they moved. The air hummed with an energy he couldn't quite describe, as if the structure itself was alive. Eventually, they reached a large, open space. Ethan's breath caught. The chamber was massive, far larger than any human-made structure he had ever seen. At its center was something breathtaking. A pool of glowing liquid pulsing with the same bioluminescence as the milk he had consumed. The surface shimmered, shifting in colors Ethan had no names for. Strange symbols lined the walls, shifting and rearranging themselves in an endless dance. Saren stepped forward and gestured toward the pool. "This is the source." Ethan's pulse quickened. "This is where the milk comes from?" "Yes," Saren confirmed. "It is the essence of all life." Ethan stared at it, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the liquid. There was something almost hypnotic about it, as if it was calling to him. He took a cautious step forward. "What happens if I touch it?" Saren's voice was calm yet firm. "You will become more." Ethan swallowed. His logical mind screamed at him to back away. He didn't understand this substance, didn't know what it would do to him. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he already knew there was no turning back. Something had begun inside him, something irreversible. And whatever the source truly was, whatever it was turning him into, he was about to find out. Ethan stood at the edge of the glowing pool, his breath shallow, his pulse thudding in his ears. The source shimmered before him, shifting in colors he couldn't fully comprehend. The air was thick with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Saren remained still beside him, its dark, endless eyes watching with quiet patience. "You hesitate," the alien observed. Ethan swallowed. "I'm a scientist. I don't just throw myself into something I don't understand." Saren tilted its head. "Yet, you already know there is no other path." Ethan clenched his fists. He didn't want to admit it. But Saren was right. He felt the pull of the source deep in his bones, in his very cells. The milk had already begun reshaping him, making him something else. Stepping into the source wasn't just a choice, it was an inevitability. His gaze flickered back to Saren. What happened to the others who drank it? A silence stretched between them before Saren finally responded. They became lost. Ethan's stomach twisted. Lost how? They resisted, Saren said simply. The source does not force change, it offers it. Those who reject its gift are torn between what they were and what they could be. They do not survive. Ethan's mouth went dry. He thought of his fellow researchers, of the pilot, of Patel. Had they been beyond saving, or had they simply refused? He looked down at his hands again. The bruises were gone. The cuts were gone. His very being was different. He took a deep breath. He had already stepped onto this path. There was no turning back now. Steeling himself, Ethan stepped forward and placed his foot into the pool. The moment his skin touched the liquid, everything changed. A surge of energy raced up his leg, through his spine, into every nerve, every fiber of his being. He gasped, stumbling as his body was enveloped by warmth. It was like sinking into the sun, searing and soothing at the same time. The world around him dissolved. For a moment, there was nothing. No chamber, no Saren, no past, no future. Just existence. Ethan's mind expanded, stretching beyond the limits of what he had once been. He could feel the source weaving into him, unraveling his old self and remaking him into something else. Memories flashed before him. His childhood, his days as a student, his first time in a research lab. He saw his failures, his triumphs, every choice that had led him to this moment. And then, he saw further. Visions of distant worlds, civilizations beyond human comprehension, beings made of light and thought and energy. He felt the pulse of the universe itself, the interconnected web of life stretching across galaxies. He was no longer just Ethan Cole. He was something more. The transformation was not painful, but it was overwhelming. His body vibrated with power, with understanding. His cells were no longer bound by the same laws of nature. He was nature, reshaped and reborn. and just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Ethan gasped, stumbling forward onto solid ground. He was back in the chamber, the pool, behind him. The glow of the source dimmed, returning to its steady pulse. He looked down at himself. His body appeared unchanged, but he felt it. A power humming beneath his skin, a connection to something far greater than himself. His senses were sharper, his mind clearer. Saren stepped forward. "It is done," Ethan exhaled. "What am I now?" Saren regarded him carefully. "You are more than human. You are a bridge." Ethan frowned. "A bridge to what?" "To understanding." He shook his head. "Understanding of what?" Saren's gaze was unreadable. "The future." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to process everything. He was no longer just a man. The knowledge, the power, he could feel it shifting inside him. And yet he was still himself. He met Saren's gaze. "What happens now?" The alien's expression didn't change, but something about the way it looked at him felt approving. "Now, you decide." Ethan stared at the shimmering walls of the chamber, at the source still pulsing behind him. The universe had just opened before him, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't just studying it. He was part of it. A new beginning. New path. Ethan took a step forward, embracing the unknown.